Overpopulation. It's the issue that's coming back. Now, I've been wanting to do a video on this for a very long time. Part of the reason I haven't is procrastination. It's taken me this long to get through a script I'm satisfied with. The other part of the reason is that a certain movie franchise featuring a big purple space warlord came and went, and is thoroughly a dead meme now, so I can do the video without having to address a fictional genocide. Suffice to say, Purple Man bad. I don't feel so good. We now stand at around 7.8 billion humans and climbing. In primitive societies, our population was limited by available food, for one thing. But thanks to the Industrial Revolution, and then the Green Revolution in agriculture, we've been able to support populations unseen in the ancient world. As our society has advanced, so too have our numbers, and the two are linked in at least some way. One advantage of a high population is that there are more people around to come up with innovations, and large populations have been linked with cities, the engine of progress. You could conclude from this that there are no real downsides to the current scale of humanity, but I think you'd be wrong. It's true enough that the Malthusian formulation of geometric population but linear agriculture has more than been disrupted by innovations such as the Haber process, in which ammonia could be isolated to create fertilizers. If it wasn't for this, we would have required more than 4 times the land area to produce as much crops as we do today. Technology is also a scarcity liberating resource, because if one material becomes scarce, a technological innovation can allow us to supplant it for another material in the same use. If rare metals used in the semiconductor industry become scarce, innovations may allow us to replace them. However, although this factor is important, we can't assume that technology will bail us out at any time conveniently. I say this as someone who believes that much of our economy will be automated by the next century. Ultimately, we enjoy a certain living standard, and we hope that technology and economic factors can create gains that are positive sum. If technology did not pull through for us, then under an increasing population we would eventually hit natural limits and we would have to reduce our living standards to survive. If technology couldn't allow us to have the same standards of comfort and health, then the material scarcity created would lower those standards. This is something we should hope to avoid. So it is the living standards and the population pressure and technological innovation that tell the whole story. Even global warming is also a population and living standards issue. Although it is the technological factor of greenhouse emissions which are the direct cause, it is the scale of the usage that allows it to affect the planetary climate. It is a planet full of people who want to drive cars when those cars are polluting. We're busy trying to create infrastructure for electric cars and build better batteries, and this is the technological solution I would support. But in the meantime, it seems like some politicians want to lower Western living standards by lowering consumption, even though we're making great progress on the green energy front, and a greater amount of bulk emissions are going to come from India and China now. That is, there are a whole load more people who want what we have now, and that's the population pressure side of the issue. Overpopulation creates all sorts of more direct problems. The most direct issue is whether our food supply can stay ahead of our population. Developed Western countries of course eat too much, leading to obesity, so we could certainly lower our consumption there, but even then it's not necessarily the case that you can redistribute all potential food around the world into actual food as far as locals are concerned. Certain areas of the world are running out of arable land and are facing issues with having enough to water that land as well. The FAO, that is, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, estimates that if we go with a projection of 2.3 billion more people by 2050, 70% more food will need to be supplied as many of the countries these people will live in increase their consumption at the same time. Arable land will be required to expand by 120 million hectares in developing countries. I quote from the report, "Much of this land suffers from chemical and physical restraints and lack of infrastructure that can't easily be overcome, and so significant investments would need to be undertaken in order to bring it into production. Part of this land is also covered by trees or subject to expanding urban settlements." They also say that water use will need to be expanded by 11%, which doesn't sound so bad, but that's with a projection for efficiency increases factored in. We could also take a broader view. Approximately 29% of the Earth's surface is land, and of that percentage 71% is habitable, because the remaining portion are barren lands, deserts and glaciers. Of the 71%, how much is currently used for agriculture with both farmland and cattle grazing land? The answer is 50%. 77% of which is livestock supporting, and 23% which is for growing crops. That's 35.5% of the total land using these figures. So if you were able to bring desolate land into production or use some advanced vertical farming method, then of course a lot more is available, but that shows the very real constraints at play here. We've used up roughly a third of the land already. Of course that leaves 2/3 filled with gigantic forests to chop down and become farmland, but isn't that itself an issue of overpopulation? We'd be forced to chop down so much and get rid of huge carbon sinks to continue feeding more and more people who will be forced into greater and greater political competition. People often say that overpopulation is not an issue because all humans could fit into New Zealand at the density of Manhattan. What this argument ignores is that tremendous amounts of land would still be needed in order to feed them. We could imagine hyper-advanced agriculture and everyone living at high urban density in our colleges, but do we actually want to do this? Do we want to live like this? To be sure, this brings in a subjective element. I personally think that on the subjective front there are too many people as soon as everyone can no longer have a fully detached dwelling. The apartment building is itself a sign of overpopulation. Returning to the objective factors, 1/3 of all available fresh water is utilised by humans, so put that on the table too. We could use less water in the developed world, certainly, but that's still a detriment and one we'll suffer with if we have to, but one we'd rather ameliorate with other means. There's also a good degree of debate about whether we are approaching phosphate scarcity. If so, this is very bad since phosphate scarcity means fertilizer scarcity, which means you can kiss goodbye to those efficiency gains which are supposed to paper over the increased demand. Other issues are our use of plastics, which I guess we can solve with technology if we come up with something as good as plastic for all those different uses. Or maybe if we're willing to lower standards we can settle for an inferior substitute that doesn't jam up the ocean. We'll do what we have to, but let's not act like more and more people is going to help this. Even when it comes to biodegradable waste, scale can be a problem. Even if you invent a substitute that degrades, we don't know what will happen when such huge amounts of it are degrading in concentrated waste choke points. Lots of biodegradable things cause problems. Technically, feces is biodegradable, but it's also toxic. Fertilizer runoff can create algal blooms where rivers meet the sea. These lower the oxygen content and kill off fish and other aquatic life. All sorts of decomposing plant material is biodegradable, but when it decomposes it gives off methane, a greenhouse gas about 25 times worse than CO2. We are certainly steaming ahead with the solar sector and that's a good thing, but even if we end up saving the planet from global warming, it's not a total upgrade in every single aspect. Solar panels require much more area than power stations to produce the same power, and the production of solar panels releases toxic silicon tetrachloride. So if you need to produce a large amount of power to support a global civilization filled with double-figure billions of people all clamouring for the same rights and living standards, you are going to have some problems even if technology saves us from the worst of it. Scale matters, population matters. It's like we have a bunch of sliders, and we could increase some things and decrease others, but if the Earth's population continues to bloom, then those other factors don't have infinite capacity to counteract the effects of that. Also, how far could a Spartan approach really go? Even if there is resource inequality between the first and third world, I'm sceptical that Western populations could get a Western populace to live more constrained lives to support the birth rates of the third world. I doubt that when fuel taxes can kick off riots. We'd end up as a third world country at the extreme end of this process. We'll suffer what we have to, but we'd really rather see if there's another way. That means looking at the population. And that's the thorny side of this issue, because developed countries have already seen declines in their birth rates. Most developed countries, except a few like Israel, are below or barely above replacement rate. In a previous video I also looked at some of the transitional issues of lowering population, and how a greying society creates economic problems. So there is an issue going from A to B, but I feel the danger on the other side of this issue is greater. Perhaps some groups could stand to increase their birth rate, but in the bigger picture an overall decline is positive for the very long term. So although the world population is increasing and is set to increase for the entire century, the exploding birth rates belong to the third world. And as China has advanced and aided by its one-child policy, not that this didn't cause problems of its own, it has been levelling off. Most growth is and will be for the duration of the 21st century the growth of Africa. UN projections made in 2004 projected African population to add 2 billion, but because of increases in the African population growth rate, the projections had to be revised upwards in 2015 to 4 billion. The global population difference as predicted by the UN has median projections of 11 billion, with the high end being a nightmarish 16 billion. It's worth noting that there are lower end predictions that show world population stabilising at 9 billion or less, but these predictions depend on urbanisation lowering birth rates at the same rate as they have elsewhere, which may not be universally true if countries pull themselves out of third world conditions but still engage in social practices that limit women's fertility choices. If the lower end predictions are more accurate, then that's great, but they're still projections. We shouldn't panic and overreact to the higher end projections, but we shouldn't underreact by relying on lower end projections either. Whatever the case, Africa is where the population future of the Earth seems to be playing out. This naturally tends to get some nasty people involved who want to get rid of all the black people by any means necessary. Of course, it's worth mentioning the Maoist third worldist types over on the left side of the issue that want to swamp the first world and destroy it to level resources. I would say that we take genocide off the table and then as far away from the table as possible. If the table is the sun, then genocide should be somewhere past the Andromeda Galaxy, if not the Hubble sphere. This disclaimer probably should have gone at the beginning of the video, but ho-hum. I shouldn't have to make such disclaimers, but such is the time we're living in. I personally think that Africa needs to secularise, and the Catholic Church and Islam among the Christian and Islamic countries of Africa deserve some blame for the unsustainable birth rates. The hostility towards birth control they promoted is still a big part of this. They also need to liberalise and for education to increase and for women to gain the independence they need to avoid becoming broodmares. Of course, part of the problem is that Africans live in an environment in which they lose enough children to need to keep having children in order to beat infant mortality. I'm sure this is an area where technology would help. Perhaps drones can deliver medical supplies where roads are cut off for weeks due to poor maintenance. All sorts of little innovations will help. Still, if it's an issue of population, we can't just rely on technology to make things right, and the governments of Africa will have to get serious about socially transforming and promoting contraception, for their sake as well as ours. Even if an Africa full of developed world countries would naturally have lower birth rates just as we do, this is not a foregone conclusion, to say the least. And we would be best not to overshoot due to cultural factors. You'll certainly see far more wars in Africa in the future if we don't get serious about it now, and you'll see a lot more unsustainable mass migration to the West as a further consequence too. There is a humane way to promote the solution and achieve the goal of bringing African population growth and world population growth down, and ensuring we have enough room to achieve a fantastic future. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there, mostly left-wing activists, who not only want to take violent and horrible solutions off the table as they should, but want to deny that overpopulation is an issue at all. They'll portray the issue as one to do with capitalism, and with global warming they'll point to the global 10% in income terms contributing the most to CO2 emissions for lifestyle usage. Of course, if you know a little about the distribution at play here, you'll realise that the global 10% figure is lower than the yearly income based on the UK's minimum wage. There's a handy calculator for this which will go in the links. That's right, it's not a capitalism issue, not an issue of inequality between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat within a country, but an issue of inequality between the first and third world. That's a much harder sell for them, so they cloak it in Marxist-sounding rhetoric, but rest assured it's third worldism. I've also seen the same kind of breadtube videos promote this article showing 100 companies being responsible for 71% of global emissions. This is another attempt to show it is the few and not the many who are most of the problem. What this ignores is that the 100 companies are mostly oil giants who are not just burning hydrocarbons for a laugh, but are meeting a demand to fuel cars and planes and trains used by everyday people. The article they like to circulate includes this critical piece of information, but it's the headline that matters for their purposes. The 71% figure includes what is sold to people. Some of the more extravagant claims about needing 4 Earths to give everyone an American standard of living are more than a bit shaky, being that they attempt to convert carbon emissions into a land area figure. The average American footprint is made up of 2/3 carbon emissions. If you subtract that, it's more like 1.5 Earths. As we've been discussing, this is not an immutable factor. It also should be noted that using the same metric, countries like Australia are above the United States, and countries like France, which are very comfortable, are ranked as needing 2.5 Earths as a global standard, again a large fraction of which is being calculated on the basis of land used to absorb emissions. That said, it's certainly the case that the First World eats a massive surplus of food that could be used to raise the level of consumption for the rest of the world, assuming perfect distribution and allowing for the political acceptance of this, which are big assumptions to say the least. The world can produce enough to feed 10 billion in theory, and you could reduce food waste in the West to help with this, and there are certain laws being passed to make supermarkets give away food they can't sell. All well and good, but even with the medium UN projection of 11 billion by 2100, that's probably not enough on its own. Some also warn that just dumping food in the Third World depresses local markets and puts farmers out of business, meaning that they are never able to produce enough for themselves. Food aid is already fraught with difficulties. If you went full Third World revolution and tried to redistribute food, the chaos in terms of distribution and the effect on Western political systems would be insane. That can't be on the table. We can accept reductions that are good for us, where we reduce waste and eat less, but we want these things to be done on our own terms and not forced down our throats. Years of aid and billions of dollars have not built African countries up to the level where they are in a position to perpetuate themselves without help. It may be that the Chinese effort to directly build infrastructure bodes better for them, though this doesn't come without strings attached, and many of the nations involved are going to be saddled with massive debts. Ultimately, population reduction has to be part of the picture. No, not an eco-fascist genocide of the Third World. No, not a Georgia Guidestones Illuminati plot, but simply a fight against the conditions in Africa that prevent women from making educated choices about contraception. Otherwise, we're going to see really nasty things happen towards the latter part of this century, and no amount of guilt-tripping the West is going to change that. One way or another, population will decline because it hits natural limits, but we'd much rather that be because people globally are living in comfortable developed environments, and not because there are colossal famines and wars. I don't want to be a doom-monger with this video, as I have faith that we can solve this problem in a way that expands people's rights, especially the rights of women in the Third World. But I also felt compelled to make this video to push back against the idea that it's a totally manufactured issue and everything is fine, because it is by ignoring small problems that we grow them into giant disasters. It may be that the lower end projections for these things are more accurate, but it's something to consider nonetheless, and we must prepare for the worst projections. Thank you.